All right, let's dive into something I'm sure a lot of you out there are curious about: ICE detention and those migrant release policies we keep hearing about. I got a ton of stuff from you guys. News articles, reports, even some FAQs. Looks like you're really trying to make sense of it all, and honestly, who can blame you?
It really can be a puzzle, especially when you've got the administration pushing for what they call mass deportations. And then you also see reports of all these migrants being released.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to add up, does it?
Yeah.
So let's try and break this down. And one thing that really jumped out at me right away was just the numbers. ICE only has funding for something like 41,500 detention beds nationwide. I mean, that just seems like incredibly limited for a country this size.
Right. It's definitely a constraint, a really tight constraint, and it has a big impact on the whole system. I mean, you've got this push to detain people,
Right.
but you only have so much space. So something has to give, and what often happens is releases, even if the administration prefers to keep detaining.
So it's a bit like trying to, I don't know, fit a square peg in a round hole, right?
Yeah.
And is that why we see this difference between, say, migrants who are detained further from the border? They seem to be more likely to be released with these monitoring programs.
Exactly. It's all about managing resources, not just physical space, but personnel and the logistics of transporting people, across these huge distances.
It makes you wonder what kind of cost-benefit analysis is going on behind the scenes there. And speaking of costs, remember when President Trump said he was going to reopen Guantanamo Bay, the detention center there, to house migrants? There was all this talk about 30,000 beds.
Right.
But then later, the report said that only like 400 beds were actually readily available.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how the rhetoric doesn't always match the reality.
Yeah.
On the ground. I mean, even repurposing an existing facility like Guantanamo, it comes with its own set of logistical and legal challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention the ethical questions that come up immediately.
Yeah. Okay. So it's easy to just sort of think, well, releases are happening just because of overcrowding, right?
Hmm.
But what you're saying is it's a lot more complicated than that.
Oh, much more nuanced. Yeah, we can't forget about the legal side of things either.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been court decisions over the years that put pretty strict limits on how long ICE can detain people, especially if their home country won't take them back. Look at the recent agreement with Venezuela, for example. That change in diplomatic relations has actually had a real impact on how Venezuelan nationals are being detained and released in the U.S.
So diplomacy becomes a factor here, almost like a bargaining chip. But couldn't that create a situation where countries could kind of hold the U.S. hostage by just refusing to cooperate?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's definitely a strategic element to these repatriations. I mean, if a country sees some benefit in not playing ball, maybe it's political, maybe it's economic, they might drag their feet or even just flat out refuse to take their citizens back. And that obviously puts more pressure on the U.S. system. It's
like a real world game of chess, but with people's lives on the line. So we've got the capacity issues, we've got the legal limitations, but I'm guessing there's more to this decision-making process, right? How does ICE actually decide who to prioritize for detention and who might be eligible for release?
That's where things get really complicated. ICE has these guidelines, and they're supposed to focus on detaining people who are considered a threat to public safety. And that could be based on a lot of different things: criminal history, gang affiliation, even suspected ties to terrorism. But those assessments, they aren't always clear-cut, and there's definitely room for interpretation.
And hold on, that's a big one. How do they even define threat to public safety? Like, what are the specific criteria? Because that sounds pretty subjective, and that could have huge consequences for people who are stuck in this system.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to raise that question. The definition of threat is definitely open to debate, and there are concerns about inconsistencies and bias creeping into the evaluation process. I mean, what one officer might consider a minor offense, another officer might see it differently. And that could lead to different outcomes for migrants with similar backgrounds.
So it's not like there's this clear-cut checklist. There's human judgment involved, which opens the door to all sorts of questions about fairness and equity in the system.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we also can't forget about the humanitarian side of things. ICE guidelines do allow for releases based on medical conditions, or if someone is the sole caretaker of a child, for instance. These are factors that acknowledge the potential for harm in certain cases.
It's like every case is this balancing act, right? You're weighing the perceived risk against the individual circumstances, the legal constraints, and then this this ever-present pressure of limited detention capacity.
Yeah. It's a complex equation, and there are no easy answers. And even when a decision is made, the journey for these migrants is far from over.
Which brings us to those monitoring programs we keep hearing about. The ankle monitors, the phone check-ins. What's the deal with those? Are they just a way to keep tabs on people while they wait for their court dates?
Yeah, so that's what's known as alternatives to detention, or APD. And it's not actually a new thing, contrary to what some people might think. These programs have been around for over a decade.
So releasing someone, but with conditions. But I did read somewhere that there's been talk of expanding these ankle monitor programs. Does that mean they're changing strategy, maybe moving away from detention altogether?
It's definitely a trend to keep an eye on. Fox News reported back in December that the administration was thinking about a pretty big expansion of ATD, probably as a way to deal with the ongoing capacity crunch we've been talking about.
So it's about finding ways to keep track of people without having to actually detain them. It does make you wonder about how effective these programs are, though. Like, how often do people actually show up for their court dates when they're on these programs?
Yeah, that's the key question, and one that deserves a closer look. There is data out there on how well ATD works, the costs, even some of the potential downsides and unintended consequences. It's not a simple solution, that's for sure, and it definitely has its critics.
Feels like we've barely scratched the surface here, and we've already uncovered so much. And, it's easy to get caught up focusing on undocumented immigrants. But these policies, they have a much broader reach, don't they? I mean, we're also talking about the administration targeting legal pathways to immigration.
Absolutely. It goes way beyond those who are undocumented, and often in ways that people might not expect. For example, the shutdown of the CBP One app. This was a tool, a legal avenue, for asylum seekers to schedule appointments at ports of entry, a crucial step in the process.
So closing the app basically shuts down a legal route and forces asylum seekers to find other ways, potentially more dangerous ways, to get in.
Exactly. And it raises some serious questions about, unintended consequences. I mean, are we pushing people towards more desperate measures, towards smugglers, riskier journeys just because we've closed off a legal option? It's something to think about.
It is. It's a good point. And this isn't the only example, right? Didn't the administration also try to end birthright citizenship for children born in the U.S. to parents who are here on non-immigrant visas?
It did. And ultimately, that move was blocked by a federal judge who said it was unconstitutional. The judge's statement was pretty strong, calling the order blatantly unconstitutional, which really highlights the legal issues at play here. It shows the tension between what the administration wants to do and the existing legal framework that governs immigration.
So you've got these legal battles going on at the same time as the policy changes. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation.
Right. And then you have the parole programs. The administration has also taken steps to either revoke or limit programs that have been used to grant temporary legal status to groups like Afghan evacuees and Ukrainian refugees.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, targeting different points of entry, different legal pathways. It paints a picture of a system that's in constant flux. How are people who are trying to immigrate legally supposed to navigate this? It must be incredibly overwhelming.
It creates a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear for those who are trying to come to the U.S. the right way. And it raises questions about what this means for the country's reputation as a welcoming nation in the long run.
And then there's the economic side of this, too. We were looking at some sources that mentioned a pretty surprising link between tariffs and immigration. Have to admit, I hadn't really thought about that connection before.
It's definitely an interesting aspect of this administration's strategy. People like former South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who's now the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, have talked about using tariffs as a way to get leverage in immigration negotiations. Basically, the idea is to put economic pressure on countries like Mexico, Canada, even China, to get them to cooperate with U.S. immigration priorities.
So it's about hitting them where it hurts in their wallets to achieve immigration goals. But what does that cooperation actually look like?
It can take different forms. For example, the administration has pushed for more cooperation in stopping the flow of fentanyl across the border. They've also tried to pressure countries to speed up the process of taking back their citizens who are living in the U.S. illegally. It's about using economic tools to try to influence migration patterns and border security.
But But does it actually work? Is this tariff strategy really getting results? And what about the unintended consequences? Could these tariffs end up hurting U.S. businesses and consumers?
Yeah, those are valid concerns. And there has been pushback. During an interview on Meet the Press, Kristen Welker pointed out to then-Governor Noem that Canada was actually facing higher tariffs than China, even though most of the fentanyl coming into the U.S. is thought to be coming from China. It raises questions about, whether this tariff policy is being applied consistently and whether it's really strategic.
It does seem a little bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Is there any proof that these tariffs are actually discouraging migration or affecting the drug trade?
It's hard to say for sure. The data is not clear-cut. It's difficult to separate the impact of tariffs from all the other things that influence migration and drug trafficking. And the economic fallout from these tariffs, both here and abroad, is a complicated issue with potentially some pretty far-reaching effects.
Every time we dig a little deeper into this, it just seems to get more complicated. We started with overcrowding in detention centers, and now we're talking about legal precedents, diplomatic maneuvers, humanitarian issues, and now international trade policy. It's like peeling an onion. You just keep finding more layers.
It really shows how interconnected these issues are. Immigration policy doesn't exist in isolation. It's tied to economics, geopolitics, human rights, even domestic politics. It's a multifaceted problem that doesn't have any easy solutions.
So where do we go from here? We've looked at what drives ICE releases, the legal constraints, the prioritization process, the alternatives to detention, even the administration's efforts to target legal pathways and use economic leverage to influence the system. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is realizing that these aren't just policies. These are decisions that affect real people, real families, real communities. We've talked about the goals of these policies, but we also need to think about the unintended consequences.
We can't just stop at the headlines. We need to look closer and ask those tough questions about the human impact. And I think you've given our listeners plenty to think about. We've talked about what the administration wants to do, but are there any downsides? We have, people like Krishomara Vignaraja. She's the president and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And she's worried about vulnerable migrants being pushed towards more dangerous routes, that they might end up relying on smugglers more or even end up stateless.
Yeah, these are serious concerns. I mean,
Yeah.
when you make it harder for people to come here legally, when those pathways are restricted or people don't think they're reliable, it can create a void, and that void is often filled by people who prey on desperation. Yeah. Smugglers, they thrive in these kinds of situations. And vulnerable migrants, especially those who are fleeing violence or persecution, they become, easy targets.
It's a tough thing to think about, that in trying to, control immigration, we might actually be making things worse, making the journey even more dangerous for people who are just looking for safety, for a better life.
And we're still seeing the effects of these policies play out. How is all of this going to affect how the U.S. is seen in the world? What message does it send to people who want to come here legally? These are questions we need to be asking, not just from a policy standpoint, but from a human standpoint, too.
It's a good reminder that we can't just focus on the numbers, the statistics.
Yeah.
I mean, behind every data point, there's a person, a life that's being affected by these decisions.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to have these conversations, to really challenge our own assumptions. Immigration, it's a complex issue. It brings up strong feelings, and it can lead to some pretty divided debates. But at the end of the day, it's about people.
It's about people looking for a better life for themselves, for their families, for safety, for opportunities.
Right. And as a society, we have a responsibility to approach this issue with compassion, but also with a commitment to justice, to really understand all the different sides of it, to think about the unintended consequences, and to work towards solutions that respect the dignity of all people.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground here. From overcrowded detention centers to legal challenges, diplomatic wrangling, even the economic tools that are being used to try and influence immigration, it's been eye-opening for sure.
And this is really just the beginning. I'd encourage everyone listening to keep learning about these issues, to dig into the sources, and to come to your own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about understanding immigration policy, it's about understanding ourselves, our values, our priorities, what kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, that's the real deep dive.
Well put. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.